Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere damp, dimly lit, and deeply unhygienic. So maybe lower the lights, put your phone face down, and let your shoulders drop a little. You don't need to picture anything too clearly. In fact, it's better if you don't. Just let the words drift by while we wander, slowly and calmly, into Victorian London, a city of empire, confidence, coal smoke, and an absolutely heroic commitment to being dirty in ways that feel almost personal. There's nothing you need to do here. Just listen. Let the fog roll in. Try not to breathe too deeply. Victorian London liked to think of itself as the center of the world, and in many ways, it was. It ran an empire so large the sun famously never set on it, mostly because the sun couldn't get through the smoke anyway. From a distance, London was power and progress. From up close, it was mud, sewage, animal waste, human waste, industrial waste, and a general sense that no one had really thought through what happens when 4 million people all use chamber pots at the same time. Let's ease into the smell first, because the Victorians certainly couldn't escape it. London smelled bad, not in a vague historical way. Not in a, oh, people didn't bathe back then myth sort of way. It smelled aggressively bad, constantly bad, wet, rotting, smoky, and sour. The kind of smell that sticks to your clothes and follows you home, because your home also smells exactly the same. The Thames was the centerpiece of this experience. It was London's pride, its highway, its water source, and, unfortunately, its main sewer. Everything flowed into the river. Human waste, animal carcasses, industrial chemicals, the contents of thousands of chamber pots emptied daily by servants who had places to be and windows to open. The river was less a river and more a slow-moving brown suggestion of water, thick with things best left undescribed, but often described anyway. Victorians called it the Great Stink, which sounds quaint until you realize Parliament actually had to stop working because the smell was so strong it soaked into the curtains. Lawmakers tried soaking cloths in vinegar and hanging them over windows, which helped approximately not at all. Imagine being so powerful you rule half the globe, but you're taken out by your own river like this. Of course you are. But before we get too close to the water, let's step back into the streets. Victorian London streets were busy, loud, crowded, and layered. There were people walking, horses pulling carts, dogs roaming freely, pigs sometimes roaming freely, and all of them contributing something to the ground beneath your feet. Horse manure alone was a daily crisis. Thousands of horses produced literal tons of waste every day, and while some of it was collected for fertilizer, most of it just sort of stayed there until rain came, and then it moved everywhere. The roads weren't clean stone or neat pavement. Many were dirt or poorly maintained cobblestone, which trapped filth in the gaps and released it gently with every step. Mud wasn't just mud, it was a composite substance, a historical smoothie of animal droppings, human waste, industrial runoff, and whatever else had fallen off a cart that day. People wore boots not for fashion, but survival. Now, Victorians were not ignorant of this. They noticed, they complained, they wrote letters, they published essays. They also, crucially, believed in miasma theory. This was the idea that disease came from bad air, not germs. Germs were still waiting their turn. So if you got sick, it wasn't because you drank contaminated water, it was because the air offended you personally. This led to some fascinating priorities. Efforts were made to improve smells rather than sanitation. Perfumes were popular, pomanders were carried, windows were opened or firmly shut depending on which direction the smell was coming from that day. Meanwhile, the actual sources of disease continued their quiet work, completely unbothered by lavender sachets. Water itself was a gamble. Drinking water often came directly from the Thames, downstream from where sewage was dumped. Filters were primitive or non-existent. Boiling water wasn't yet common practice. So when cholera outbreaks happened, which they did repeatedly, the response was confusion followed by moral judgment. The poor were blamed for being poor. Of course they were. Let's drift slowly into the homes, because surely inside was better. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was very much not. Wealthy Victorian homes could be surprisingly clean on the surface. Servants scrubbed floors, polished furniture, and aired rooms when possible. But beneath the surface, things got strange. Plumbing was still developing. Indoor toilets existed, but they were often poorly connected, poorly ventilated, and prone to backing up. When that happened, smells didn't politely stay in one room. They traveled through walls, through floors, through your entire sense of peace. Middle and lower class homes often relied on chamber pots. These were emptied into cesspits or directly into the street. Night soil men collected waste, usually at night because it was less embarrassing that way. This was dangerous, unpleasant work, and it paid accordingly, which is to say, not well enough. Crowded housing made everything worse. Entire families lived in single rooms. Ventilation was minimal. Washing clothes was labor-intensive and infrequent. Bodies sweated. Smoke settled. Food spoiled quickly. Rats were enthusiastic participants in domestic life. They lived in walls, under floors, and sometimes directly in beds. They were not subtle. And then there were the factories. Industrialization brought jobs and money, and also soot. So much soot. Coal smoke poured from chimneys day and night, settling over the city like a heavy blanket. Buildings turned black, lungs filled slowly with particulate matter. Fog mixed with smoke to create what Londoners called pea supers, thick yellow smogs that reduced visibility to a few feet. People walked into lampposts, boats crashed into each other. Crime increased because no one could see anything, which criminals appreciated. The smell of coal was constant. It got into clothes, hair, food. It was the background scent of progress. Combined with sewage and animal waste, it created a citywide perfume that no bottle could replicate. Not that anyone would want to.
Personal hygiene, to be fair, was not ignored. Victorians did wash. They bathed more than medieval people, contrary to popular myth. Soap was widely used, but water access mattered. Heating water took time and fuel. Full baths were occasional luxuries for many. More common were partial washes, faces, hands, maybe feet. Everything else was negotiated. Clothing added another layer. Heavy fabrics trapped sweat and smells. Corsets restricted breathing. Multiple layers were worn year-round. Laundry was done infrequently because it was expensive and exhausting. Clothes were brushed more than washed, which helped with dirt but not odor. Perfume filled the gap, sometimes aggressively. Public health slowly began to matter more. Figures like John Snow, who famously traced a cholera outbreak to a contaminated water pump, challenged miasma theory with inconvenient facts. Removing the pump handle worked. People stopped dying. This was awkward for the bad air crowd, but progress rarely asks permission. Eventually, massive sewer projects were built. Engineers like Joseph Bazalgette redesigned London's sanitation system, redirecting waste away from drinking water. It was expensive. It took time. It saved lives. And it happened only after the smell became so unbearable that Parliament itself demanded action. Empathy is nice, but inconvenience is powerful. Even so, Victorian London never became clean in the modern sense. It became cleaner, slightly, incrementally, enough to function, enough to continue believing in itself as civilized. And that belief mattered deeply. Victorians were obsessed with morality. Cleanliness was associated with virtue, dirt with sin. This made actual dirt inconvenient because there was so much of it everywhere. So it was rebranded. Poor neighborhoods were dirty because the people were morally lacking. Wealthy areas were cleaner because, obviously, virtue. This logic allowed society to continue comfortably. Filth wasn't a systemic issue, it was a personal failing. Problem solved. As we drift toward the end of this chapter, imagine walking slowly along a Victorian street at dusk. Gas lamps flicker, horses clop past, someone empties a bucket from a window. The air is thick, but familiar. Everyone coughs a little, no one mentions it. This is just how things are. London would survive this. It would modernize. It would clean itself eventually. But for now, it sat in its own mess, confident, expanding, and faintly offended that anyone would complain. The poor lived closer together. This was not a lifestyle choice. It was gravity. People drifted toward work, and work clustered around factories, docks, railways, and anything that made smoke. The closer you were to these places, the cheaper the housing became, mostly because no one with options wanted to live there. Entire neighborhoods grew dense and vertical, with buildings subdivided again and again until rooms became suggestions rather than spaces. In many parts of Victorian London, a single house might contain dozens of families. Each family occupied one room, sometimes half a room. Privacy was theoretical. Noise was constant. Smells layered on top of each other until they stopped being distinguishable and became a general atmosphere. Windows were few. Fresh air was a rumor. These buildings were old. Many were medieval in origin, retrofitted poorly for modern life. Floors sagged, walls cracked, roofs leaked. Dampness crept in and never really left. Mold thrived. So did disease. Tuberculosis, known politely as consumption, moved slowly and socially, lingering for years. It was romanticized in art and literature, which is easy to do when you don't have it. Water access was communal. Pumps served entire streets. If one pump was contaminated, everyone drank it anyway, because thirst is persuasive. Waste disposal was equally shared. Cesspits filled quickly. When they overflowed, which they did, waste seeped into foundations and wells. Sometimes it burst upwards, surprising residents in ways no one enjoyed. Children played in the streets because there was nowhere else to go. The streets were filthy. Children adapted. They always do. Cuts became infected. Fevers were normal. Survival itself was a kind of background noise. If a child made it to adulthood, that was considered success. Food storage was another challenge. Without refrigeration, food spoiled fast. Meat was risky. Milk was famously dangerous, often diluted with water that was itself unsafe. Sometimes chalk or other substances were added to improve appearance. No one was trying to poison anyone exactly. It was more a system-wide shrug. Markets smelled strongly of fish, blood, rot, and humanity. Slaughterhouses operated within city limits, often near residential areas. Animal blood ran into gutters, offal piled up. Dogs and rats fought for scraps. This was not hidden. It was visible, audible, and aromatic. Rats deserve special mention. Victorian London had a lot of them. Big ones, confident ones. They lived off human waste and human neglect, both abundant resources. They spread disease, but they were also simply everywhere. People trapped them, poisoned them, occasionally fought them for sport. None of this made a meaningful dent. Fleas moved freely between rats and people. Lice thrived in crowded conditions. Skin infections were common. Scratching was constant. No one thought this was unusual. It was just part of having a body. Public baths did exist. They were built gradually as part of reform movements. Using them cost money, which limited their reach. Pride also played a role. Being told you needed a bath felt like an accusation. Many preferred to endure dirt rather than accept judgment. Charity workers visited poor neighborhoods with clipboards and opinions. They noted filth carefully, often more carefully than they noted hunger. Cleanliness campaigns focused on moral conduct.
Reform. If people could just learn better habits, everything would improve. Structural problems were harder to address and much less satisfying. Meanwhile, wealthier Londoners moved west. Geography became social policy. The East End housed docks, factories, warehouses, and the people who worked in them. The West End housed Parliament, palaces, parks, and air that was only slightly less terrible. Distance became a form of hygiene. Even so, filth traveled. Smoke didn't respect class. Smog drifted wherever it wanted. The Thames carried everyone's waste equally. Disease crossed neighborhoods without checking income. Cholera did not care about manners. When outbreaks happened, panic followed. Streets emptied, shops closed. People fled if they could. Those who couldn't stayed and waited. Death came quietly, through dehydration and weakness, not drama. Bodies were buried quickly, sometimes too quickly. Graveyards filled. Some were built on top of old ones. Bones surfaced occasionally. No one lingered on that. The city responded slowly. Committees formed. Reports were written.
Debates dragged on. Meanwhile, people continued to live, work, cough, and smell their way through each day. Life did not pause for reform. Factories added another layer of grime. Workers came home coated in soot, grease, and chemical residue. Washing it off required water and energy. Sometimes it stayed. Industrial chemicals stained skin permanently. Acid fumes damaged teeth. Eyes burned. This was considered the price of progress. Children worked too. They crawled into chimneys to clean them, emerging blackened and scarred. They worked in textile mills, breathing fiber dust. They worked long hours for little pay. Cleanliness was not a priority when exhaustion was total. The idea of leisure hygiene barely existed for the working class. Bathing was functional when possible. Cleaning was constant but never complete. Dirt returned faster than it could be removed. This created a sense of futility that settled into bones. And yet, there was pride. People decorated rooms with lace and pictures. They scrubbed doorsteps. They did what they could with what they had. Filth was not a moral failure here. It was an environmental condition. The city itself seemed alive, breathing out smoke and breathing in people. It expanded relentlessly. New arrivals poured in from rural areas, unprepared for the density and pace. They learned quickly, or they didn't. Survival favored adaptability. As night fell, the city did not rest. Waste collection happened after dark. Carts rattled through streets, sloshing. Gas lamps flickered. Shadows stretched. The smell intensified as cooler air trapped it close to the ground. People slept anyway. Humans are remarkably flexible. By now, Victorian London had developed a strange relationship with its own dirt. It complained loudly, acted slowly, and adapted constantly. Filth was an inconvenience, a hazard, and a defining feature. It shaped behavior, health, and social boundaries. The city kept going, always forward, always expanding, always smelling faintly or strongly of itself. And as London grew, so did the quiet realization that dirt was not just unpleasant, it was political, it was economic, it was profitable for some, and lethal for others. The Victorian body was not sealed. That's the important thing to understand. It was porous, open, constantly exchanging material with the city around it. Smoke went in, soot settled. Water carried things where water should never have carried anything at all. The boundary between person and environment was thin, negotiable, and frequently ignored. Lungs took the worst of it. Every breath in London was an experiment. Coal smoke, factory exhaust, dust from unpaved roads, fibers from textiles, chemical vapors from workshops, all of it floated politely into the air and waited to be inhaled. Chronic coughs were normal. Wheezing was common. Spitting was constant. Streets were dotted with dark stains that were not rain. Black phlegm was not alarming. It was expected. Doctors called it London particular, which sounds refined until you realize it's just your lungs trying to cope. Life expectancy reflected this slow suffocation. Many people simply wore out early. Their bodies aged faster than the calendar suggested. Skin absorbed its share, too. Washing helped, but soap could only do so much. Industrial workers developed rashes, burns, and discoloration. Chimney sweeps, especially children, were prone to cancers caused by soot embedding itself into skin folds. This was noticed eventually, not quickly. Eventually, hair trapped smoke and grease. Beards became filters. Hats absorbed smells that never left. Clothing acted like a second skin, soaking up the city and releasing it slowly wherever you went. People carried London with them at all times. Teeth suffered quietly. Acidic air weakened enamel. Diets heavy in cheap carbohydrates and sugar did the rest. Toothaches were common. Dental care was rudimentary. Extraction was popular. False teeth existed and were often made from human teeth purchased from the poor or harvested from battlefields. Nothing went to waste. Eyes burned constantly. Redness was normal. Vision suffered. Glasses were expensive and imperfect. Reading in poor light strained eyes further. Gas lamps flickered and smoked. Candles dripped. Darkness was never complete, but clarity was rare. Disease moved through bodies the same way dirt did, slowly, casually, without ceremony. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery, tuberculosis. Names became familiar. People recognized symptoms. They also accepted outcomes. Death was present, but not dramatic. It arrived like a neighbor stopping by unannounced. Children bore the city early. Infant mortality was high. Fevers swept through cramped homes. Teething was dangerous. Diarrhea was deadly. Parents mourned quietly because there was no energy left for prolonged grief. Life continued. It had to. Doctors worked within limited frameworks. Germ theory was emerging, but not yet dominant. Treatments focused on balance. Bloodletting lingered. Tonics were prescribed. Fresh air was recommended, which was ironic in London, but well-intentioned. Moving to the countryside was ideal. Most could not. Hospitals existed, but they were not havens. They were crowded, underfunded, and sometimes worse than home. Infection spread easily. Surgery was improving. Anesthesia existed, but antiseptic practices were still developing. Survival was uncertain.
Mental health was not named as such, but strain was visible. Urban life compressed people emotionally as well as physically. Noise never stopped. Privacy did not exist. Stress accumulated quietly. Alcohol helped. Gin was cheap and popular. Drunkenness was both escape and problem. Temperance movements blamed individuals rather than conditions. Sobriety was framed as moral strength. Poverty was framed as weakness. Dirt was framed as choice. This made reform simpler in theory and impossible in practice. Smell played a constant role in how bodies were perceived. The poor smelled poor. The wealthy smelled better, mostly because they could afford space and laundering. Perfume marked status. Odor became a social signal. Judgment followed automatically. Public transport added intimacy. Omnibuses and trains packed bodies together. Breathing was shared. Heat built up. People learned to endure proximity. Complaints were internalized. Silence was polite. Workplaces were rarely clean. Factories were loud and dangerous. Dust hung in the air. Machines caught clothing and limbs. Injuries were common. Recovery depended on luck and charity. Compensation was rare. Domestic servants absorbed dirt secondhand. They cleaned constantly, handling waste, soot, and laundry. Their own health suffered quietly. They slept in cramped quarters. They ate leftovers. They inhaled chemicals used for cleaning, which were often harsh and unregulated. Even leisure carried filth. Parks were escapes, but they were shared with animals. Horse manure dotted paths. Ponds were stagnant. Picnics involved wiping dirt off food and pretending it wasn't there. Bathing, when possible, was restorative. Public bathhouses offered warm water and temporary relief. People emerged pink and relaxed, briefly lighter. This did not last. The city reclaimed them within hours. Clothing hygiene became a science of compromise. Undergarments were changed more often than outer layers. Linen absorbed sweat. Wool trapped warmth. Corsets compressed organs, making breathing harder in already compromised air. Fashion did not care. Women carried additional burdens. Long skirts dragged through the streets, collecting filth. They brought it home. Cleaning them was laborious. Fashion demanded it anyway. Respectability outweighed practicality. Pregnancy in this environment was risky. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion complicated childbirth. Midwives worked under pressure. Doctors were called for difficult cases. Mortality was high. Survival was celebrated quietly. The city left marks that lasted generations. Stunted growth, chronic illness, weak lungs. These became family traits, attributed to heredity rather than environment. It was easier to believe that. As reform slowly took hold, small improvements appeared. Cleaner water reduced cholera, better sewers reduced stench, smoke regulations were discussed, rarely enforced. Progress was uneven and slow. Still, the Victorian body adapted. Humans always do. People learned which streets to avoid, which pumps to trust, which foods were safer. Knowledge passed informally. Survival strategies spread faster than policy. By the late 19th century, Londoners were tough in ways that went unremarked. Their resilience was ordinary, their endurance uncelebrated. They lived inside a machine that wore them down gently, daily, without apology. And they kept going, to work, to home, to sleep, bodies absorbing the city, day after day, carrying its dirt not as a failure, but as a fact. Next, we'll drift toward the people who tried to fix all this, the reformers, the engineers, the well-meaning meddlers who believed dirt could be organized away. Some of them were right, some of them were very wrong, but all of them smelled London the same way everyone else did. Chapter 4: Cleanliness, Committees, and the Slow March of Improvement. Victorian reform did not arrive all at once. It arrived in meetings, in reports, in thick documents that smelled faintly of ink and optimism. People noticed the dirt long before they agreed on what to do about it, and even longer before they actually did anything useful. This was progress in its natural state, cautious, argumentative, and allergic to spending money. Public health became a topic of polite concern in the early 19th century, usually after something unpleasant reached the right people. Cholera helped. It was very persuasive. It did not stay in poor neighborhoods the way everyone hoped it would. It wandered, casually, into respectable streets and drawing rooms. Suddenly, dirt was not just unsightly, it was threatening. Reformers emerged. Some were doctors, some were engineers, some were politicians with a talent for speeches and very little patience for smells. They wrote about sanitation in earnest tones. They argued that filth was not a moral condition, but an environmental one. This was a radical idea at the time and made many people uncomfortable. Edwin Chadwick was one of the loudest voices. He believed strongly in sanitation, efficiency, and paperwork. He also believed the poor needed to be managed firmly for their own good. His reports were detailed and relentless. He described filth in exhausting detail, partly to shock, partly to justify sweeping reforms. He was not beloved, but he was effective. Chadwick argued that disease was cheaper to prevent than to treat. This appealed to lawmakers in a way compassion never quite did. Clean water, proper waste removal, and better housing were framed as economic investments. Health became a budget item.
Engineers followed. This is where things quietly improved. Joseph Bazalgette designed London's sewer system with admirable thoroughness. He planned for future growth. He built large, very large. His tunnels carried waste away from the city instead of letting it linger politely beneath it. This reduced smell, disease, and parliamentary complaints, a rare trifecta. Construction was disruptive. Streets were torn up. Traffic suffered. Complaints multiplied. But gradually, the system worked. The Thames began to recover, slowly. It would take decades, but the direction changed. Waste no longer flowed quite so enthusiastically into drinking water. Water companies were regulated. Filtration improved. Pump handles became less suspicious. Cholera outbreaks declined. People noticed. Some credited science, others credited God. Results mattered more than explanations. Housing reform lagged behind. Slums were acknowledged but not easily solved. Clearing them displaced people without providing alternatives. New housing was built slowly and often poorly. Overcrowding persisted. Dirt adapted. Smoke was harder to control.
Coal powered everything. Factories resisted regulation. Homeowners loved their fires. Clean air was desirable in theory and inconvenient in practice. Laws were proposed, softened, and ignored. Smog remained a feature. Public baths and washhouses expanded. They offered affordable access to hot water. Usage increased. Cleanliness improved modestly. Pride still interfered. Being told to bathe remained uncomfortable. Still, progress accumulated. Education campaigns targeted habits. Posters encouraged cleanliness. Pamphlets explained hygiene. Schools taught basic sanitation. Children learned to wash hands, eventually. Behavior changed slowly. Generations passed. Garbage collection improved. Streets were swept more regularly. Night soil removal became more organized. This reduced surface filth, if not underlying conditions. The city looked cleaner, which satisfied many. This visual cleanliness mattered. Appearances carried weight. A clean street suggested order. Order suggested virtue. Filth was pushed out of sight when possible. Sewers hid waste. Smokestacks were taller. Out of sight, out of mind. Middle-class homes embraced cleanliness as identity. White fabric signaled control. Regular bathing became a marker of respectability. Soap advertisements flourished. Hygiene became aspirational. Dirt became embarrassing. Servants bore much of this labor. They cleaned constantly, polished relentlessly, maintained the illusion of purity in a city that resisted it. Their work was invisible by design. Medical understanding improved. Germ theory gained ground. Antiseptics reduced infection. Hospitals became safer. Doctors washed hands more often. Mortality declined, slowly, in steps. Vaccination campaigns began. Smallpox was targeted. Resistance existed, of course. Personal liberty arguments appeared early and loudly. Public health navigated politics then as it does now. Death rates dropped. Infant mortality declined. Life expectancy rose, not dramatically, but noticeably. These changes accumulated quietly, without fanfare. No one announced the end of filth. It simply receded unevenly. Still, inequality persisted. Poor neighborhoods benefited last. Improvements reached them eventually, but not equally. Dirt lingered where power did not. This pattern remained consistent. Victorian London never became clean in the modern sense. It became cleaner than before. That was enough to feel triumphant. Empire liked its narratives tidy. By the end of the century, the city smelled different. Not good, just different. Less sewage, more smoke. Progress has its own scent. People adjusted again. They always did. New problems replaced old ones. Industrial pollution became the next quiet killer. But that's another story. For now, the city stood on the edge of modernity. Sewered, filtered, regulated. Somewhat cleaner, still crowded, still noisy, still imperfect. And underneath it all, the memory of filth lingered. In habits, in architecture, in bodies shaped by earlier decades. Next, we'll drift into the private spaces of the respectable. The parlors, the bedrooms, the places that claimed cleanliness most loudly. Because those spaces had their own secrets, and they were rarely as clean as they pretended to be. Chapter 5. Respectable Homes and the Illusion of Purity. Victorian respectability leaned heavily on the idea of cleanliness. A clean home suggested a clean mind. A clean body suggested moral discipline. This was convenient because it allowed people to feel virtuous without addressing the larger environment that coated everything in soot by default. You could scrub your doorstep daily and still inhale coal smoke every time you opened your mouth. Both things could be true. Middle and upper-class homes were showcases. Parlors were arranged carefully. Furniture was polished. Curtains were drawn and redrawn depending on the light and the smell outside. Carpets were thick and plush, which looked luxurious and quietly trapped everything. Dust, hair, skin, ash. Bits of the city embedded themselves deeply and stayed. These carpets were rarely cleaned thoroughly. Beating them outdoors was common, sending clouds of dust into the air and into nearby neighbors. This was accepted as normal. Indoor vacuuming did not exist in a meaningful way. Dirt settled back in and waited patiently. Upholstery was another repository. Stuffed chairs absorbed odors over years, sweat from bodies, smoke from fires, food smells from kitchens, perfume layered on top in an attempt to manage it. The result was complex, not unpleasant exactly, just heavy.
Bedrooms were private spaces, but not hygienic by modern standards. Sheets were changed infrequently, especially in winter when laundry was difficult. Mattresses were stuffed with horsehair or straw. Bugs lived inside them comfortably. Bed bugs were common and unremarkable. Fleas traveled easily. Scratching at night was normal. Chamber pots lived under beds or in corners. They were emptied daily by servants or by family members themselves in more modest homes. Accidents happened. Smells lingered. Deodorizers were used. Ventilation helped when weather allowed. Indoor plumbing improved gradually, but early toilets were temperamental. Water traps dried out. Sewer gases leaked back into homes. People worried about smells, not microbes. Vent pipes were misunderstood. Bathrooms became places of anxiety rather than comfort. Kitchens were busy and warm. Food preparation involved raw meat, unwashed produce, and limited refrigeration. Milk soured quickly. Leftovers were risky. Cooks relied on experience and smell. Food poisoning happened often and quietly. Servants handled most cleaning. Their work began early and ended late. They scrubbed floors, carried water, washed linens, and emptied waste. Their own quarters were usually small and poorly ventilated. Cleanliness was for display, not distribution. Laundry was a major operation. Water had to be heated, soap made, clothes soaked, scrubbed, wrung, and hung. This took hours and physical effort. It was done as often as resources allowed, which varied widely. Personal washing in respectable homes involved routines. Morning washes at basins, weekly or monthly full baths. Hair washing was less frequent, especially for women. Long hair was difficult to manage. Oils were brushed through it instead. Soap was widely used but varied in quality. Some were harsh and irritating. Skin dryness was common. Cracked hands were accepted. Gloves hid evidence. Clothing served as a barrier between body and world. Undergarments absorbed sweat. Outer garments protected modesty and warmth. Changing underlayers mattered more than washing coats. This system worked, more or less. Smell management was subtle. Fresh air was encouraged, but not too much. Windows were opened briefly. Fireplaces drew air upward. Potpourri sat in bowls. Perfume was applied carefully. Too much suggested vulgarity. Children were trained in cleanliness as discipline. Clean hands before meals, brushed hair, proper posture. Dirt was a sign of lax parenting. Outdoor play complicated this. Children returned muddy. They were cleaned again. Repetition taught order. Illness disrupted everything. Sick rooms were set aside. Smells were masked. Bedding was changed more often. Servants were overworked. Fear lingered quietly. Guests were received in the cleanest rooms. Kitchens and servant areas were kept out of sight. This physical separation reinforced social boundaries. Dirt belonged to labor. Cleanliness belonged to leisure. Despite all this effort, the city intruded constantly. Smoke seeped in through cracks. Dust settled overnight. Smells drifted from streets and neighbors. Absolute cleanliness was impossible. The performance mattered more than the result. This performance shaped identity. Being clean meant being respectable.
Being respectable meant being worthy. This logic justified inequality elegantly. Poor homes were dirty because their occupants failed. Respectable homes were clean because their occupants tried. Structural conditions disappeared from the narrative. Reformers both reinforced and challenged this idea. Clean homes were promoted as solutions. Environmental causes were acknowledged cautiously. Responsibility remained personal. By evening, respectable homes glowed softly. Lamps were lit, curtains closed. The outside world was held at bay. Inside, people breathed slightly easier. Not clean air, just controlled air. They slept surrounded by fabric, dust, and the faint hum of a city that never quite rested. Comfort was relative. Purity was aspirational. And in the morning, the cleaning began again. Next, we'll drift outward into the spaces shared by everyone, the streets, the transport, the public conveniences that tried and often failed to keep London functioning. Because no amount of private scrubbing could save a city that was dirty by design. Chapter 6: Streets, Transport, and the Shared Experiment. Victorian London happened in public. Homes mattered, certainly, but the real experience of the city unfolded outside, where everyone collided gently, constantly, and usually smelled a little bit like each other by the end of the day. The street was where class lines blurred just enough to be uncomfortable, and where dirt performed at its most democratic. Streets were not simply routes from one place to another. They were workplaces, marketplaces, playgrounds, dumping grounds, and social spaces. Everything happened there, all at once. Vendors shouted, horses snorted, carts rattled, children ran, dogs slept wherever they felt like it. And through all of this, waste accumulated with quiet dedication. Street cleaning existed, but it was inconsistent. Some areas were swept regularly, others waited. Rain helped sometimes. It also made things worse. Dry filth became wet filth, heavier and more mobile. Gutters filled with slurry. Boots sank slightly with every step. People learned to walk carefully, eyes down, scanning for danger. Crossing the street was an athletic event. Horse traffic was constant. Omnibuses stopped and started unpredictably. Droppings were unavoidable. Stepping stones were placed at crossings to help pedestrians avoid the worst of it, which suggests just how bad the worst of it was. Public transport added density. Omnibuses were packed, especially during commuting hours. Passengers sat close, very close. Knees touched, elbows overlapped. Breath was shared, smells mixed. This was tolerated in silence because there was nowhere else to go. Trains expanded rapidly. Railway stations were marvels of engineering and chaos. Steam filled the air. Coal smoke hung low. Platforms were grimy. Trains themselves were not clean.
Upholstered seats absorbed years of use. Third-class carriages were particularly rough. Ventilation was minimal. Windows were opened when weather allowed. Sometimes they did not open at all. Underground railways emerged later in the century. They were innovative and deeply unpleasant at first. Steam-powered trains ran below ground, filling tunnels with smoke and heat. Passengers emerged damp and coated. The novelty wore off quickly. Use continued anyway. Public conveniences were scarce. Men relieved themselves where they could. Women had fewer options and planned outings carefully. Urination in alleys was common and mostly ignored. Chamber pots were emptied into gutters. The line between private and public waste was thin. Markets were sensory overload. Fish markets smelled of salt and rot. Meat markets dripped steadily. Vegetable stalls piled produce high, brushing dirt off before selling. Customers trusted their senses. Smell was diagnostic. A good nose mattered.
Public fountains existed and were decorative as well as functional. Drinking fountains appeared gradually, offering cleaner water. They were celebrated as moral improvements. Using them felt virtuous. This mattered. Public baths were social spaces. People queued, they talked, they soaked. Warm water relaxed muscles and spirits. Cleanliness here was collective, not private. It was practical and briefly equalizing. Street lighting improved visibility and safety. Gas lamps reduced crime in some areas. They also added smoke and heat. Lamplighters moved through the city nightly, performing maintenance with quiet efficiency. Their work was noticed only when it failed. Public parks expanded. Green spaces were intentional lungs for the city. Trees absorbed smoke slightly. Grass offered visual relief. People strolled. Children played. Dirt was still present, but organized. This was dirt with rules. Benches were shared. Hands touched surfaces touched by hundreds of others. Germs moved freely. No one thought about this yet. Worry focused on air, not contact. Miasma still hovered in theory and imagination. Public toilets, when they existed, were experimental. Ventilation issues persisted. Smells lingered. Maintenance varied. People approached cautiously. Relief was mixed with apprehension. Spitting was common and socially acceptable. It cleared throats clogged with soot. Streets bore the evidence. Attempts to discourage it came later, framed as refinement rather than health. Public drinking water points were watched carefully after cholera discoveries. Pump handles became symbols of safety or danger. Communities learned which sources to trust. Information traveled by word of mouth faster than official notices. Police patrolled streets, navigating the same filth as everyone else. Their boots wore down quickly. Their uniforms absorbed the city. Order was maintained imperfectly. Dirt complicated everything. Funerals moved through streets regularly. Death was visible. Coffins passed shops and homes. Processions were slow. Mourners walked carefully to avoid slipping. Respect and mud coexisted. Street vendors sold food meant to be eaten immediately. Pies, eels, bread. Fingers touched coins, touched mouths. Hygiene was minimal. Hunger overruled concern. Illness followed occasionally. This was accepted. Public entertainment filled streets, too. Musicians played. Performers gathered crowds. Noise layered on top of smell. Sensory overload became normal. Silence was rare. At night, streets changed character. Waste removal occurred. Shadows deepened. Lamps flickered. Smells intensified as air cooled. People moved faster. Home felt safer by comparison. Despite everything, streets were familiar. People knew their routes. They navigated hazards intuitively. Children learned quickly where not to step. Adults developed tolerance. The city trained its inhabitants well. Reformers targeted streets as visible problems. Cleaning schedules improved. Regulations were posted. Enforcement varied. Clean streets made good impressions. This mattered to visitors and investors. As the century progressed, paving improved. Sewers reduced surface waste. Horse manure remained stubborn. Discussions about mechanical transport began. Horses would eventually be replaced. Not yet. The street was where London revealed itself most honestly. Private spaces could pretend, public ones could not. Dirt was shared here, negotiated daily. People complained, adapted, and carried on. They always did. The street did not wait for perfection. It functioned anyway. Chapter 7. Dirt as Identity, Entertainment, and Moral Lesson. Victorian London did not just live with dirt. It talked about it constantly, wrote about it, moralized it, turned it into metaphor, warning, entertainment, and occasionally self-congratulation. Filth became language. And once something becomes language, it stops being just a problem and starts being useful. Newspapers loved dirt. They described slums in loving detail, lingering on smells and sights with a kind of horrified fascination. Articles walked readers through narrow alleys and overcrowded rooms, pointing out every stain and broken window. This was presented as concern. It was also spectacle. Middle-class readers could feel informed, sympathetic, and superior all at once, a very efficient emotional combination. Illustrations accompanied these stories: dark figures hunched in shadows, children with hollow eyes, piles of refuse drawn just a little larger than life. The message was clear. This is what happens when morality fails, or when society fails, depending on the writer. The ambiguity was convenient.
Novelists joined in. Charles Dickens, of course, wandered through dirty London with purpose. His city was alive, grimy, crowded, and emotionally damp. He used filth to signal injustice, cruelty, neglect, but he also used it as texture. Dirt made the story feel real. Readers recognized it. They nodded along. Yes, that's how it smells. Other writers were less charitable. Slums were exoticized. The poor were portrayed as part of the environment, interchangeable with refuse. Dirt blurred into character. People became landscapes. This made distance easier. Sympathy could be managed. Theater played its part. Melodramas featured fallen women and corrupted men emerging from filthy surroundings. Clean spaces signaled redemption. Dirt signaled danger. Audiences understood the visual shorthand immediately. No explanation required. Public lectures addressed sanitation with dramatic flair. Speakers described disease crawling through streets, riding on foul air. Audiences shuddered politely. Applause followed calls for reform. Then everyone went home to the same city. Photography added another layer. Early social photographers documented slums and labor conditions. Images froze dirt in place. These photographs were powerful. They were also curated. Angles chosen, subjects selected, reality framed. Exhibitions displayed models of improved housing and sewer systems. Cleanliness became aspirational. Progress was put on display. Visitors admired miniature pipes and orderly streets. It all looked very achievable at that scale. Meanwhile, guidebooks warned visitors where not to go. Certain neighborhoods were labeled dangerous, dirty, morally suspect. This protected reputations and reinforced boundaries. Dirt became geography. Language absorbed it. Filthy described not just objects, but people and behaviors. Cleanliness equaled respectability. Dirt equaled vice. These associations hardened over time and resisted evidence to the contrary. The poor were described as living in filth, rather than filth being imposed upon them. This subtle shift placed responsibility neatly. Reform could focus on behavior rather than infrastructure, cheaper, more satisfying. Charity campaigns used dirt strategically. Too much detail repelled donors. Too little failed to move them. The right amount produced sympathy without discomfort. This balance was refined over decades. Children's literature joined in. Stories taught hygiene as virtue. Dirty characters suffered consequences. Clean ones succeeded. Washing hands became moral training. This worked eventually. Even humor relied on dirt. Cartoons depicted overflowing streets and exaggerated smells. Jokes softened anxiety. Laughter made endurance easier. Shared discomfort bonded people lightly. Tourists were warned, but also intrigued. London's dirt became part of its mystique, a city so important it could afford to be unpleasant. Visitors complained and bragged in equal measure. Foreign observers commented freely. Some were horrified. Some were impressed by resilience. Comparisons were made. National pride flared defensively.
Criticism was met with reform or denial, depending on mood. The Great Exhibition of 1851 presented a clean, organized vision of Britain to the world. Glass, light, order. Behind it all, the city remained stubbornly itself. This contrast mattered. It showed what could be, at least temporarily. Over time, narratives shifted. Dirt became a problem being solved rather than a defining trait. Progress stories replaced horror stories. Statistics replaced smells. Mortality rates declined. This felt like victory. But memory lingered. The idea of dirty London persisted long after conditions improved. It became historical identity, something overcome, something that proved toughness. Even today, echoes remain. Victorian dirt lives in museums, novels, and stereotypes. It is remembered more vividly than the cleanliness that followed. Filth is memorable. Clean water is boring. As reform succeeded unevenly, new narratives formed. Industrial pollution replaced sewage as villain. Smoke became the enemy. The story adapted. Dirt found new forms. Victorians, for all their talk, never fully escaped their environment. They learned to explain it, justify it, and slowly change it. Talking about dirt was part of that process. Naming it gave a sense of control. And control mattered deeply in a city that felt overwhelming. Language organized chaos. Stories made endurance meaningful. By turning filth into metaphor, Victorians managed to live with it. They could point, describe, and move on. This didn't clean the streets, but it cleaned consciences. As the century closed, London stood between identities, no longer the open sewer of earlier decades, not yet the regulated metropolis it would become. The stories adjusted accordingly. Chapter 8. When the dirt began to lose ground. By the late Victorian period, something subtle shifted, not suddenly, not cleanly, just enough that people started to notice the absence of certain problems rather than their presence. Cholera stopped visiting so often. Streets smelled slightly less aggressive. The river offended fewer noses. None of this felt miraculous. It felt overdue.
This is how improvement usually arrives. Quietly, without applause, without a clear before and after moment. One day, you realize fewer people are dying of the same thing, and no one throws a parade about it. London's sewer system, now fully operational in most areas, did its work invisibly. Waste flowed away. This alone changed the city more than any moral campaign ever had. The Thames remained polluted, but it was no longer the city's digestive tract. Fish began to return in small numbers. This was noticed and reported with cautious optimism. Water quality improved steadily. Filtration became standard. Reservoirs were protected. Pump scandals became rarer. People trusted their water slightly more, which was a big deal in a city where trust had been hard-earned. Medical practice changed tone. Germ theory moved from controversial to accepted. Doctors washed hands more consistently. Instruments were cleaned. Hospitals adopted antiseptic routines. Infection rates dropped. This felt technical rather than emotional, which made it easier to accept. Public health became institutional. Health boards collected data. Mortality statistics were published. Numbers replaced anecdotes. This was progress you could graph. It made reform feel rational instead of sentimental. Housing improved unevenly. Some slums were demolished. New housing blocks were built, often with better ventilation and sanitation. They were not always pleasant, but they were less lethal. Overcrowding persisted, but standards existed now, at least on paper. Smoke remained a stubborn problem. Coal still ruled, but awareness grew. Smoke abatement societies formed. Complaints increased. The idea that air quality mattered gained traction. Enforcement lagged, but the conversation shifted. Personal hygiene routines evolved.
Regular bathing became more common across classes. Soap was cheaper and better. Toothbrushes appeared more frequently. Cleanliness became habit rather than performance. Laundry technology improved. Better soaps, mechanical aids. This reduced labor and increased frequency. Clothes smelled less like the city and more like soap, which felt modern. Children benefited noticeably. Infant mortality declined. Childhood illnesses became survivable. School attendance increased. Health education spread quietly through classrooms. Public spaces felt safer. Streets were better lit. Pavement improved. Waste collection became routine. The city looked less chaotic, even if it still felt crowded. Attitudes shifted too. Dirt was no longer destiny. It was a problem to be managed. This mattered psychologically. People expected improvement now. Complaints became demands. The poor were still blamed for many things, but environmental explanations gained ground. Slums were discussed as problems of design, not just character. This was progress, even if it arrived reluctantly. Memory softened. Older Londoners remembered worse times. Younger ones took improvements for granted. Stories of overflowing cesspits and deadly pumps began to sound historical rather than immediate. This created nostalgia, oddly enough. The rough old city was romanticized. Grit became character. Filth became flavor. The danger was safely in the past. By the turn of the century, London was changing again. Electricity appeared. Motor vehicles replaced horses slowly, reducing manure while adding new fumes. Problems shifted shape. The Victorian dirt did not vanish. It transformed. Industrial pollution lingered. Inequality remained. But the specific, overwhelming filth of earlier decades receded. People noticed the quiet, the absence of constant sickness, the reduced fear of water, the slightly cleaner air on certain days. No one said, "The city is clean now." That would have been tempting fate. But people relaxed their vigilance just a little. This is how forgetting began. Not total forgetting, selective forgetting. The worst memories faded first. The smells were hardest to recall accurately. Memory has limits. The city moved forward, carrying traces of its past in infrastructure and habit. Sewers hidden beneath streets, regulations written in response to disasters no one wanted to repeat. Victorian London did not end in a clean line. It dissolved into the modern city gradually, like dirt rinsing away under running water. And once the water runs clean long enough, you stop thinking about where it came from. Chapter 9. What the city never quite let go of. Even after the worst of the Victorian filth eased its grip, London never truly reset. Cities don't. They accumulate. Layers of habit, infrastructure, belief, and quiet damage settle in and stay put long after the original problem has been technically solved. Clean water flowed, sewers worked, streets improved, and still something lingered. Some of it was physical. Old buildings retained their pasts stubbornly. Walls absorbed decades of smoke. Floors remembered spills no one could scrub out. Basements stayed damp. Pipes rattled with age. The city's skeleton had been built during dirty years, and it carried that history forward.
Infrastructure decisions made under pressure became permanent. Sewers followed routes dictated by 19th century priorities. Roads curved around forgotten obstacles. Neighborhoods developed personalities shaped by what they had once endured. The city's map became a quiet archive of its former problems. Health improved overall, but unevenly. Poorer areas benefited later and less completely. Lung disease remained common among working families. Generations carried the after effects of pollution and malnutrition. Bodies remembered what policies forgot. Class boundaries hardened in subtler ways. Cleanliness remained a marker of respectability.
Middle-class norms became standards everyone was expected to meet, regardless of resources. Dirt was less visible, but judgment remained sharp. Public health successes created new expectations. When illness struck, it felt like failure rather than fate. Responsibility shifted to systems, then back to individuals when systems fell short. The old habits of blame adapted easily. Housing continued to be a problem. Slums disappeared only to be replaced by overcrowded estates. Sanitation improved, but space remained scarce. Density stayed high. Stress lingered. Clean pipes did not guarantee comfortable lives. Cultural memory softened reality. The Victorian era became quaint in hindsight. Soot and struggle were aestheticized. Brickwork and gaslight became charming. The suffering embedded in them faded from view. Tourism later leaned into this nostalgia. Foggy streets and cobblestones became selling points. The city's former dirtiness was transformed into atmosphere. Filth repackaged as romance. It was safe now, mostly. Language preserved old ideas. Clean still meant good. Dirty still meant suspect. These associations outlived the conditions that created them. Metaphor proved more durable than sewage. Environmental issues returned in new forms. Industrial pollution replaced human waste as the dominant concern. Smoke gave way to smog. Chemicals replaced dung. The enemy changed costumes, but not intentions. The city adapted again. Regulations followed disasters. Technology responded to necessity. Progress continued its slow, uneven march, always reactive, rarely generous. Londoners retained a particular resilience. Living through dirt had trained them. They complained efficiently. They adapted quickly. They trusted improvement cautiously. There was also a quiet pride in survival. The city had endured itself. That mattered. It became part of identity. London was tough because it had been unpleasant. Modern sanitation made daily life easier, but it also removed a shared hardship. People stopped noticing what kept them safe. Clean water became invisible. Waste removal became expected. Gratitude faded. This is the paradox of success. When systems work well enough, they disappear from attention. Only failure draws the eye. Victorian dirt taught this lesson thoroughly. Underneath modern streets, the old systems still run. Basel Jetty sewers still carry waste away. They do their job silently. They are monuments no one visits. Occasionally, reminders surface. Flooding reveals old pipes. Construction uncovers forgotten cesspits. Bones emerge from building sites. The past nudges the present gently, just to be remembered. London learned cleanliness slowly and reluctantly. It did not emerge purified, it emerged practiced, skilled at managing mess rather than erasing it. This may be the city's true legacy, not that it became clean, but that it learned how not to drown in its own success. As time passed, new generations grew up without knowing the worst of it. They inherited habits without memories. They benefited from reforms they did not witness. And that is how cities move forward, not by erasing their past, but by building over it, layer by layer, until the dirt becomes foundation. Chapter 10. The Quiet Lesson Beneath the Pavement. Victorian London does not end with a moral. It never did. It simply settles into the background of everything that came after, like sediment at the bottom of a river that now looks clean from the surface. The lesson it offers is not inspirational, it's practical. Cities become dirty when they grow faster than they care for themselves, and they stay dirty when discomfort is tolerated just a little too long. The Victorians were not uniquely careless, they were ambitious. Growth came first. Infrastructure followed when the smell reached Parliament, or when disease stopped respecting social boundaries. This pattern repeats endlessly, just with new materials and new excuses.
What makes Victorian London stand out is how thoroughly it documented its own discomfort. It wrote reports, it drew illustrations, it photographed itself at its worst, it argued loudly about whose fault the dirt was, and then slowly it fixed some of it. The fixes were not glamorous: pipes, drains, regulations, data collection. None of these made good stories. That's why the filth is remembered more clearly than the solution. Crisis is vivid, maintenance is dull. Maintenance, however, is what saved lives. The city learned that dirt is not a moral failing, even if it liked pretending otherwise. Filth followed density, poverty, and neglect with predictable loyalty. Wherever people were packed tightly and resources were thin, dirt followed. This was not mysterious, it was logistical.
London also learned that hiding dirt does not remove it. Early reforms focused on smell and appearance. Sewers that leaked gases back into homes taught painful lessons. Out of sight is not the same as resolved. This, too, is a lesson that keeps needing to be relearned. The idea of public health emerged here not as compassion, but as necessity. Clean water mattered because sick workers were inefficient. Sanitation mattered because death disrupted commerce. Morality followed practicality, not the other way around. Once systems improved, people forgot why they existed. Pipes became invisible. Clean streets became expected. The fear that had driven reform evaporated. This forgetting was comfortable. It was also dangerous if it went too far. Victorian London reminds us that infrastructure is memory. It encodes past mistakes into concrete and brick. When it works, it hums quietly beneath us. When it fails, history reintroduces itself abruptly. The city also shows how inequality shapes dirt. Those with power experienced filth last and least. Those without endured it longest. This pattern, too, remains stubbornly familiar. Cleanliness follows influence. Progress did not arrive evenly. It never does. Improvements clustered where pressure was highest. Elsewhere, people waited. They adapted. They survived. Their endurance rarely made it into official narratives. The romantic image of Victorian London, the fog, the lamps, the brick, floats free of its original context. It is charming now because the danger is gone. Nostalgia is a luxury only available once the smell fades. What remains useful is the understanding that cities are living systems. They require constant care. Dirt accumulates quietly. It does not announce itself until it overwhelms. Prevention is unremarkable. Disaster is memorable. Victorian London was not uniquely dirty. It was simply honest in its mess. It grew faster than its systems and paid the price. Then it invested heavily to stop paying it again. This pattern has repeated in every major city since. Different materials, same logic, same reluctance, same eventual realization that clean water and waste removal are not optional extras. The uncomfortable truth is that modern cleanliness rests on forgotten labor and buried structures. We walk over solutions every day without noticing them. This is success, but it is also vulnerability. When we stop noticing, maintenance slips. When maintenance slips, dirt waits patiently. It always does. Victorian London teaches this without drama, without heroes, without villains, just people adapting to consequences they didn't fully anticipate. And perhaps that is why it makes such a good bedtime story, not because it is comforting, but because it is steady, predictable, human. A city gets dirty, people complain, some people suffer, others debate, engineers build, life improves, memory fades, the cycle pauses, until it begins again. Chapter 11. The Residual Rhythm of Daily Life. Even as the physical filth of Victorian London faded, the habits it imposed lingered. Life had a rhythm dictated by survival, social expectation, and infrastructure. Streets,
Homes and workplaces shaped routines as much as individual choice. People moved in patterns learned from necessity, often long after the original threat had diminished. Morning began with water, always. Before pipes, it was a chore: fetching, carrying, boiling, rationing. After pipes, it was still ritualized: hand washing, face washing, teeth brushing. These were exercises in control, a way to assert order in a city that had once seemed ungovernable. Even in well-off households, water was precious and schedules mattered. Waste could not be created casually. Breakfast followed, usually simple but with attention to hygiene: tea, bread, porridge. Kitchens remained hot and noisy, even in the improved city. Fires burned steadily, cleaning was constant, and children were taught to observe careful habits. Spills and crumbs were combated immediately, as if proximity to disorder risked character itself. Commutes and errands reinforced exposure. Streets never fully became sanitized. Dust rose with each footstep, horse or vehicle. People learned to navigate consciously. Boots were polished, hems checked, gloves adjusted. These small actions carried the memory of previous hardships. Filth trained instinct before knowledge did. Industrial environments reflected ongoing adaptation. Factories were cleaner, but not pristine. Textile mills still produced fiber clouds. Shipyards retained oily residues. Industrial hazards persisted, though their lethality declined. Laborers learned strategies for endurance. Brakes, protective clothing, and subtle avoidance became embedded in routines. Markets retained their sensory intensity. Food handling improved, yet smells and textures reminded buyers of past vulnerabilities. Awareness of contamination became instinctual. Street vendors and shopkeepers balanced safety with sales. Experience informed trust, often more than regulation.
Children internalized lessons early. Schools emphasized personal cleanliness, hand washing, and orderly habits. Play adapted to surroundings. Mud puddles and soot-stained walls persisted in some neighborhoods, keeping alertness high. These behaviors carried forward, forming silent but consistent discipline. Social interaction maintained a layer of performative hygiene. Shaking hands, sitting at tables, exchanging currency, each gesture was shaped by memory. Surfaces were still unclean. Awareness of contamination shaped behavior. Small routines, repeated daily, became both habit and cultural expectation. Leisure maintained its connection to public conditions. Parks and theaters offered reprieve, but exposure to crowds continued to remind citizens of the city's ongoing negotiation with dirt. Outings were timed, routes planned, clothing chosen to minimize discomfort. These decisions blended survival with social display. Even in private spaces, residual habits lingered. Servants continued labor-intensive routines, maintaining polished surfaces, laundering frequently, and managing odors. Homeowners supervised, inspected, and refined practices. Cleanliness remained a marker of order, even as the acute dangers that inspired it waned. Dirt became both literal and metaphorical background. People rarely confronted it directly. Instead, they incorporated avoidance and mitigation into rhythm. Daily life became choreography informed by past vulnerability. The city itself dictated movements, reactions, and priorities. Medical awareness persisted alongside habit. Illness still occurred, but fewer catastrophic outbreaks reshaped the population. Awareness of hygiene, water quality, and food safety became normalized. Disease control moved from crisis response to maintenance, subtly shaping behavior and expectations. The legacy of Victorian London's dirt was subtle but enduring. It instilled routine vigilance, attention to surfaces, and an instinct for risk management. These patterns became invisible over time, yet they defined daily existence. The lessons of a filthy city, hard-earned and repeated over decades,
persisted quietly in posture, timing, and practice. And so the rhythm continued: water, meals, work, errands, leisure, rest. A steady cycle built atop centuries of trial, error, and incremental improvement. The city remained alive, humans adapted, and the old filth lingered only as memory embedded in habit, structure, and caution. Chapter 12. Stories of Cleanliness and Contamination. Even as streets were swept, sewers worked, and water flowed clearer, the stories about dirt refused to vanish. Victorian London's filth persisted in imagination, literature, and art long after it had begun to disappear from the physical world. Narrative became a way to manage memory, assign meaning, and rehearse morality. These stories shaped perception and behavior as much as infrastructure did. Writers used dirt to signal everything from neglect to moral failure. Dickens, as always, led the way. His novels wove the city's grime into character development. Filthy neighborhoods suggested corruption. The streets themselves were almost characters, interacting with humans, shaping events. Dirt symbolized suffering, endurance, and occasionally redemption. Readers absorbed these lessons whether consciously or not, forming expectations of how the city worked and how people should behave within it. Other authors treated filth more sensationally. Newspapers and penny fiction exaggerated slums, disease, and urban decay for entertainment. The poor were both subjects of pity and cautionary examples. Smell, stain, and clutter became narrative shorthand. Readers internalized a version of London that was darker than reality, sharper and morally charged. Dirt was never neutral. It was informative. It communicated status, behavior, and consequence. Illustrations reinforced these ideas. Artists rendered slums in rich tactile detail, soot-coated walls, broken windows, children playing amid refuse. These images were widely circulated and memorably detailed. Visual literacy of filth shaped public perception more effectively than data. People recognized what they had experienced daily, but now saw it stylized, contained, and moralized. Public lectures and reform pamphlets employed similar tactics. They described cholera and typhoid outbreaks in elaborate terms, emphasizing the links between waste, behavior, and health. Fear was used deliberately. Filth was narrated as a threat to morality and economy. Audiences shivered politely, then they acted when convenient, supported reforms, or quietly hoped someone else would take responsibility. Photography offered a new dimension. Early social documentary photography recorded slums and labor conditions, often with stark realism. These images were used in reform campaigns, exhibitions, and publications. Dirt became evidence, not just story. The camera froze it, made it permanent. Photographs were curated and interpreted, but their visual impact was undeniable. They created empathy, outrage, and occasionally superficial satisfaction that something was being done. The theater incorporated filth symbolically. Melodramas often placed characters in settings designed to convey disorder, danger, or moral compromise. Clean parlors and polished streets represented virtue. Soot-stained back alleys and crowded markets signaled challenge. Audiences understood immediately. Smell, touch, and dirt were suggested through dialogue, set design, and costume, rather than experienced directly. Children's literature formalized hygiene as narrative lesson. Stories paired virtue with cleanliness, dirt with misbehavior, and carelessness with consequence. Bathing, washing hands, and changing clothes became moral acts in miniature. These lessons were internalized slowly, contributing to a culture where ritualized hygiene was both expected and aspirational.
Housing reform continued, though unevenly. Slum clearance extended beyond the center of London, displacing residents, sometimes improving conditions, sometimes simply relocating problems. Tenement blocks were built with running water, drainage, and ventilation in mind, offering a level of hygiene previously unimaginable. Yet density remained high and inequities persisted. Cleanliness advanced, but human behavior and urban inequality created friction. Transport evolved. Electric trams began to replace horse-drawn omnibuses, reducing street waste incrementally. Underground railways expanded, replacing steam with electricity in some lines. Streets became less treacherous and slightly less aromatic. Noise persisted, but dust and dung decreased. Mobility improved without eliminating the sensory imprint of the city. Public health administration matured. Boards collected data consistently. Mortality statistics informed urban planning. The city became more legible. Disease was no longer accepted as inevitable. It became measurable, predictable, and increasingly preventable. Citizens internalized the reality that survival was supported by both technology and governance. Cultural memory of filth persisted. Stories, illustrations, and newspapers reminded residents of where they had come from. The narrative of improvement became part of identity. Citizens could take pride in progress without experiencing it firsthand. Nostalgia softened the harsh reality of previous decades. The foggy, soot-laden streets became an aesthetic reference, a romanticized backdrop rather than a present hazard. Social habits adapted alongside infrastructure. Hand-washing and bathing became habitual across more classes. Laundry technology made frequent washing feasible. Clothing and interiors were selected with maintenance in mind. Cleanliness retained its social significance, even as the reasons for vigilance changed from immediate survival to aspirational propriety. Education integrated hygiene into daily life. Schools emphasized hand-washing, dental care, and proper use of public conveniences. The younger generation internalized practices that previous generations had learned through discomfort, observation, and trial. Behavior shifted slowly, reinforced by institutional authority. By the final decades of the century, London had transformed from a city dominated by visible, pervasive filth into one managed through systems, routines, and social expectation. Dirt had not vanished. It had been relocated, controlled, and relegated to memory and infrastructure. Citizens experienced less fear, less exposure, and fewer overt hazards, even as the city remained complex, crowded, and sometimes chaotic. The city's identity had evolved. Clean streets, regulated water, and managed waste were markers of civic competence. Modernity had arrived not through sudden miracle, but through decades of incremental, laborious, and often frustrating effort. And yet, the lessons of the past, the vigilance, habits, and stories born of filth continued to guide behavior, subtly shaping the urban experience. Next, we'll float into the reflection of these transformations, the quiet consequences of improvement, the stories told about cleanliness, and the enduring human memory of a city that once smelled very strongly of itself. Because progress leaves footprints, and Victorian London left plenty. Chapter 15: Memory, Progress, and the Lingering Scent of the Past. Even as modernity reshaped London, the past lingered. Not in obvious ways. No one stepped in horse dung every morning anymore, but in habits, expectations, and cultural memory. Victorians had learned to live with discomfort, and that learning was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Clean streets and flowing water did not erase the decades of vigilance, they only shifted its focus. People remembered what had been: the smell of soot on fabric, the faint tang of waste in the gutters, the cautious approach to crowded markets. All of it persisted in stories, habits, and subconscious instincts. Generations who had not experienced the worst still carried echoes, transmitted by parents, educators, and domestic staff. Instruction and imitation became a quieter, subtler form of endurance. Progress was measured in small victories: fewer outbreaks of disease, safer water, reduced street waste, cleaner public spaces. People could walk more freely, children could play with less risk, and the urban environment began to feel predictable rather than precarious. Yet this predictability required maintenance, both social and infrastructural. Pipes needed care, streets needed sweeping, habits needed reinforcement. Cleanliness was a discipline, not a permanent state. Stories about filth persisted because they were useful. Writers, journalists, and illustrators continued to evoke the chaotic, smelly city as a moral and social lesson. These accounts reminded citizens of both human vulnerability and civic responsibility. The past was narrated to inform the present and guide the future. Even as smells faded, the metaphors endured. Dirt became an allegory for neglect, disorder, and social failure, and cleanliness became synonymous with virtue, control, and modernity. Education and public campaigns reinforced this memory. Children learned hand washing, the careful handling of food, and attention to personal hygiene, not just for health, but as a performance of respectability. Adults, trained by experience, continued to exercise habits ingrained over decades. The lessons of filth, survival, and adaptation had become second nature, a quiet rhythm underpinning urban life. Even architecture bore the imprint of these experiences. Buildings designed for ventilation, drainage, and hygiene reflected lessons learned under duress. Streets laid out with gutters, covered sewers, and regulated waste disposal demonstrated a city that had internalized its own history. Modern conveniences were, in a sense, monuments to past filth, silent reminders of what had been endured to reach a functional, livable present.
Culturally, filth remained a reference point. Foggy, soot-stained streets appeared in literature and visual arts long after the air improved. Novels romanticized danger and chaos, giving the modern reader a sanitized thrill of the past. Public memory retained the drama, while urban systems quietly performed the reality. The city had learned to separate story from survival. By the early 20th century, London was fundamentally transformed. People could traverse the city without daily negotiation with dirt and disease. Public health was institutionalized. Infrastructure operated efficiently. Yet the psychological imprint of filth, the vigilance, the caution, the structured habits, remained a living inheritance. Victorian London's legacy was as much human as structural. Dirt had shaped behavior, expectations, and identity. It had trained bodies and minds in patience, caution, and awareness. It had informed morality, aesthetics, and social hierarchy. And even as physical filth receded, its lessons endured, quietly, rhythmically, in the way people moved, cleaned, and lived in the city. Chapter 16. Lessons Beyond the Streets. Victorian London's story of filth and recovery is more than a tale about water, sewers, and smoke. It is a story about adaptation, memory, and the interplay between human behavior and urban environment. Cities, after all, are living systems, shaped by the habits, expectations, and rituals of those who inhabit them. Filth teaches lessons not only through discomfort, but through the rhythms it imposes and the changes it necessitates. Even as infrastructure improved, the city's residents retained the imprint of experience. They moved carefully, washed thoroughly, and monitored their surroundings. Habits born of necessity persisted as cultural norms. Cleanliness became both a marker of status and a practical safeguard. Lessons learned during periods of chaos continued to shape behavior long after the immediate threat had passed. This interplay between environment and behavior is subtle. Streets cleaned, sewers covered, and rivers filtered did not erase vigilance, they transformed it. People internalized the risk, anticipating it even when it was reduced. Rituals of hygiene became codified in family life,
education, and professional practice. The psychological residue of filth remained embedded, shaping expectation, etiquette, and perception. Cultural memory preserved the story even more vividly than the physical reality. Novels, illustrations, newspapers, and photographs continued to narrate the city's dirt. Filth became metaphor. It represented danger, disorder, moral failure, and social inequality. Cleanliness, conversely, symbolized virtue, civility, and progress. These narratives reinforced behaviors and expectations, extending the influence of the environment beyond immediate experience. Infrastructure, too, served as a silent teacher. Pipes, drains, and regulated waste disposal demonstrated lessons in practicality and foresight. They encoded knowledge about risk management, public health, and urban planning. Citizens learned from their surroundings as much from stories. The city itself became a teacher, offering feedback on the consequences of neglect or oversight. The human imprint remained equally profound. Generations carried forward knowledge, caution, and habits. Children learned what to avoid, how to navigate risk, and how to maintain personal and domestic order. Adults reinforced these lessons through ritualized practice. Even as physical danger diminished, behavioral adaptations persisted. The city trained its inhabitants subtly, embedding lessons into everyday life. This dynamic between environment, behavior, and narrative is not unique to Victorian London. It illustrates a broader principle. The character of a city shapes its people, and in turn, people shape the city. Infrastructure, culture, and habit interact continuously, producing patterns that endure long after visible signs of past hardship have disappeared. Finally, Victorian London reminds us that progress is incremental and uneven. Streets become cleaner, water becomes safer, and disease declines gradually. Yet memory and habit lag, creating a buffer of resilience. Filth, in its own way, educates persistence, vigilance, and adaptation. The lessons are subtle, often invisible, and carried forward silently by those who live among them. Chapter 17. The Long Shadow of Victorian Sanitation. By the early 20th century, London had changed in ways that were both visible and invisible. Streets were cleaner, sewers functional, water treatment standard, and public health increasingly institutionalized. Yet beneath this apparent progress lingered the shadow of the past, less in odor or appearance, more in habits, expectations, and social memory. The lessons of filth, learned through decades of exposure, adaptation, and survival, persisted in ways that were subtle but profoundly influential. Behaviorally, Londoners retained patterns honed in the worst decades. Hand washing, scrubbing, careful food preparation, and attention to domestic hygiene became ingrained practices. These behaviors had originated as survival strategies in the face of chaos and danger. Now they were part of daily routine, often followed without conscious thought. Ritualized cleanliness had become both instinct and social expectation. Public health continued to evolve. Municipal authorities tracked disease, implemented vaccination campaigns, and regulated housing more systematically. Outbreaks were smaller, more contained, and increasingly preventable. Residents internalized an understanding of risk and safety, and embodied knowledge passed from parents to children and reinforced by education and public campaigns. Awareness became a quiet part of identity, a legacy of prior vulnerability. The physical city bore its own memory. Sewer systems, paved streets, and regulated water flows were enduring infrastructure, functioning as silent reminders of the lessons learned from past neglect. Even when not actively considered, these systems shaped daily life, guiding behavior and moderating exposure. Infrastructure became a form of pedagogy, encoding knowledge into the environment itself. The human imprint remained equally profound. Generations carried forward knowledge, caution, and habits. Children learned what to avoid, how to navigate risk, and how to maintain personal and domestic order. Adults reinforced these lessons through ritualized practice. Even as physical danger diminished, behavioral adaptations persisted. The city trained its inhabitants subtly, embedding lessons into everyday life. This dynamic between environment, behavior, and narrative is not unique to Victorian London. It illustrates a broader principle. The character of a city shapes its people, and in turn, people shape the city. Infrastructure, culture, and habit interact continuously, producing patterns that endure long after visible signs of past hardship have disappeared. Finally, Victorian London reminds us that progress is incremental and uneven. Streets become cleaner, water becomes safer, and disease declines gradually. Yet memory and habit lag, creating a buffer of resilience. Filth, in its own way, educates persistence, vigilance, and adaptation. The lessons are subtle, often invisible, and carried forward silently by those who live among them. Chapter 17. The Long Shadow of Victorian Sanitation. By the early 20th century, London had changed in ways that were both visible and invisible. Streets were cleaner, sewers functional, water treatment standard, and public health increasingly institutionalized. Yet beneath this apparent progress lingered the shadow of the past, less in odor or appearance, more in habits, expectations, and social memory. The lessons of filth, learned through decades of exposure, adaptation, and survival, persisted in ways that were subtle but profoundly influential. Behaviorally, Londoners retained patterns honed in the worst decades. Hand-washing, scrubbing, careful food preparation, and attention to domestic hygiene became ingrained practices. These behaviors had originated as survival strategies in the face of chaos and danger. Now they were part of daily routine, often followed without conscious thought. Ritualized cleanliness had become both instinct and social expectation. Public health continued to evolve. Municipal authorities tracked disease, implemented vaccination campaigns, and regulated housing more systematically. Outbreaks were smaller, more contained, and increasingly preventable. Residents internalized an understanding of risk and safety, and embodied knowledge passed from parents to children and reinforced by education and public campaigns. Awareness became a quiet part of identity, a legacy of prior vulnerability. The physical city bore its own memory. Sewer systems, paved streets, and regulated water flows
improved. These practices were subtle, rhythmic, and often invisible to outsiders, yet they structured daily life profoundly. Servants were central to this ongoing negotiation with cleanliness. Trained during the worst decades of the 19th century, they knew how to manage dirt, odors, and surfaces with precision. Floors were scrubbed, linens boiled, and kitchens maintained as both functional and presentable spaces. Their labor allowed middle and upper-class families to inhabit a world that seemed orderly, even if the city beyond their walls remained less predictable. Knowledge, discipline, and vigilance were transmitted quietly from servant to servant, creating continuity across generations. Children absorbed routines early. Daily washing, careful handling of food, and attention to clothing were taught systematically, often reinforced with social expectation or mild censure. These practices were instilled not only for health, but for moral development. Cleanliness remained associated with virtue, self-respect, and respectability. By adulthood, these lessons were internalized, performed instinctively, and rarely questioned. Kitchen and dining routines reflected both hygiene and inherited caution. Food preparation followed carefully timed and structured steps. Raw ingredients were washed, cooking utensils maintained meticulously, and leftover management was rigorous.
The memory of contamination and disease, though historically distant, informed attention to detail. Meals became both sustenance and practice in orderliness. Laundry continued as a central domestic concern. The smell of soot and smoke, combined with previously inconsistent water quality, had long necessitated frequent washing. Even as conditions improved, these routines persisted. Sheets, clothing, and linens were laundered with care, often daily, creating an environment where cleanliness became habitual, internalized, and socially reinforced. The spatial organization of homes reflected lessons learned from the city's past filth. Ventilation, separation of work and living spaces, and careful storage of food were designed to reduce risk and reinforce order. Floors, surfaces, and storage were managed to prevent accumulation of dirt or disease. Homes were, in essence, microcosms of urban hygiene practices, demonstrating the continuity of adaptation on a domestic scale. Leisure was even influenced. Children's games, recreational outings, and interactions with the wider world were conducted with an awareness of exposure, germs, and social propriety. Play and socialization became exercises in risk management, balancing enjoyment with learned caution. The legacy of exposure to urban filth had shaped perception and action in ways that became invisible yet persistently influential. Cultural habits reinforced these practices. Advice manuals, magazines, and educational materials emphasized routine, order, and hygiene, normalizing behaviors rooted in the city's difficult past. Cleanliness became aspirational, expected, and morally coded. The domestic sphere was both protective and instructive, transmitting lessons quietly but effectively. By the early 20th century, the household had become a site of structured vigilance. The overt chaos of Victorian filth had faded, but the imprint remained. Families lived in environments that were orderly, predictable, and hygienically managed, yet the rhythms of care, observation, and attention reflected decades of experience. Chapter 19: Public Spaces and the Legacy of Vigilance. While the domestic sphere absorbed lessons of filth, London's public spaces evolved in parallel, shaping behavior, perception, and social expectation. Parks, streets, schools, and transport systems became arenas where the city's memory of dirt quietly influenced everyday life. Even as sanitation improved, the rhythms of vigilance learned from decades of exposure persisted in subtle but pervasive ways. Parks were perhaps the most visible attempt to impose order on shared urban space. Designed for leisure, exercise, and socialization, they were carefully managed, paths swept, lawns maintained, and waste removed regularly. Yet the Victorians' past experience with filth shaped both design and behavior. Children were taught where to walk, adults monitored their belongings, and visitors developed an instinct for avoiding hazards. These spaces became controlled, orderly environments where the city's previous chaos was both absent and remembered. Streets, though cleaner, retained cues from their history. Cobblestones, gutters, and carefully maintained pavements reminded residents of how traffic, weather, and waste had once been managed or mismanaged. People walked deliberately, avoiding puddles, mud, or lingering refuse. Behavioral patterns, once driven by necessity, persisted as habit and social expectation. Observing these rhythms became a form of tacit education, passed silently from one generation to the next. Schools formalized the behavioral imprint of urban filth. Hygiene lessons, routines for hand washing, and education about disease prevention became standard. Children learned that cleanliness was not only a personal responsibility, but also a social expectation. These lessons reinforced domestic habits while preparing the next generation to navigate public spaces safely. Vigilance became normalized, internalized, and largely invisible. Transport systems reflected both progress and residual caution. Trains, omnibuses, and trams were cleaner and more reliable than in earlier decades, yet passengers remained attentive to contact, surfaces, and personal hygiene. The memory of past exposure to disease and grime informed subtle behaviors. Folded coats to avoid floor dust, careful handling of tickets, and strategic seating choices. Public transport became a space where experience, habit, and infrastructure intersected. Markets and commercial areas continued to reflect the city's layered history. Even as regulations improved food safety and public hygiene, buyers and sellers maintained routines shaped by prior risk. Observation, selection, and cautious interaction became standard. Sensory awareness, sight, smell, touch, guided decisions, demonstrating the persistent influence of past filth on modern behavior. Public behavior was also socially mediated. Cleanliness remained a marker of respectability and social standing. Citizens monitored one another subtly, reinforcing norms without overt enforcement. The city, in essence, carried forward lessons learned in the streets, schools, and homes, translating past hardship into ongoing social calibration.
Cultural narratives amplified these lessons. Literature, journalism, illustration, and photography preserved the memory of filth, even as its physical presence faded. Stories of crowded alleys, overflowing sewers, and polluted rivers continued to instruct, entertain, and moralize. Cleanliness became coded as virtue, disorder as moral or social failure, and vigilance as both practical and ethical. The past, though physically diminished, remained alive in imagination and instruction. Socially, filth influenced expectations of behavior and status. Clean homes, careful attire, and personal hygiene were markers of respectability, signaling both morality and competence. Class distinctions were reinforced through access to clean environments and the ability to perform hygiene practices. Even as infrastructure improved, inequality persisted, quietly shaping who benefited most from the city's reforms. The psychological imprint of filth extended beyond individual habits. Collective caution, awareness, and vigilance became embedded in Londoners' identity. Memory, instruction, and observation combined to produce a population attuned to risk, health, and order. The city's history of dirt, disease, and adaptation shaped not only daily routines, but also social expectations and civic consciousness. By this point, London had become a city of managed cleanliness. Physical filth was less pervasive, but the behavioral, cultural, and psychological lessons endured. The city had learned to anticipate, regulate, and survive in ways that were invisible, yet deeply influential. Modern Londoners benefited from infrastructure they rarely noticed, guided by habits and expectations quietly inherited from the past. Chapter 22. Lessons for the Modern City. As we settle into the final reflections, it's clear that Victorian London's struggle with filth offers lessons far beyond 19th century streets. The story is not simply about dung, smoke, or overflowing sewers. It is about adaptation, memory, and the interaction between humans and their environment. Modern cities, while technologically advanced, inherit patterns and behaviors shaped by the past, and understanding those legacies can illuminate how urban life functions today. Infrastructure teaches silently. Water systems, sewers, and street planning are lessons encoded in brick and pipe. When they function, they are invisible. When they fail, their absence is immediately felt.
The Victorians learned this painfully, and Londoners internalized vigilance as a result. Modern residents benefit from these same lessons, often without awareness, moving through cities structured by choices and failures made over a century ago. Behavioral adaptation remains central. Habit, caution, and vigilance, once responses to immediate danger, became normalized and internalized. Cleanliness, organization, and careful observation became cultural expectations and markers of social competence. Children learned them from parents, schools reinforced them, and adults enacted them without conscious thought. The rhythms of life, subtly shaped by past exposure to filth, continue to influence urban behavior. Cultural memory amplifies infrastructure and behavior. Stories, art, and literature preserve awareness of past hardship, embedding moral and practical lessons in collective consciousness. Even as the physical danger disappears, these narratives shape perception, judgment, and expectation. The city becomes both material and symbolic, offering guidance through architecture, habit, and story. Inequality remains persistent, even in a cleaner environment. Access to resources, space, and safe conditions still shapes experience, just as it did during the Victorian era. The city's legacy of filth reminds us that progress is uneven. Infrastructure alone cannot erase disparities. Social vigilance and cultural expectation continue to compensate for gaps in resource distribution, even in modern urban life. Finally, the Victorian experience demonstrates resilience and adaptation. Humans and cities co-evolve, responding to challenges, learning from errors, and embedding those lessons in habit, culture, and design. Filth, once a crisis, became a teacher. Its lessons, though uncomfortable, subtle, and often invisible, endure across generations. As we conclude this long, gentle drift through London's history of filth, it is worth remembering that progress is cumulative. Infrastructure, behavior, and cultural memory work together to create livable cities, even if the challenges of yesterday seem distant. The city continues to teach its inhabitants, silently, rhythmically, and persistently. And somewhere beneath the streets, the pipes still carry away the things we prefer not to think about, letting the city above hum along quietly, while generations of Londoners continue to act on lessons learned long ago. Because the story of dirt is never truly over, it only becomes quieter, subtler, and embedded in the rhythm of life. Chapter 23. The Quiet Continuity of Urban Life. As we settle into the final pause in our exploration, it becomes clear that Victorian London's struggle with filth offers lessons far beyond 19th century streets. The story is not simply about dung, smoke, or overflowing sewers. It is about adaptation, memory, and the interaction between humans and their environment. Modern cities, while technologically advanced, inherit patterns and behaviors shaped by the past, and understanding those legacies can illuminate how urban life functions today. Infrastructure teaches silently. Water systems, sewers, and street planning are lessons encoded in brick and pipe. When they function, they are invisible. When they fail, their absence is immediately felt. The Victorians learned this painfully, and Londoners internalized vigilance as a result. Modern residents benefit from these same lessons, often without awareness, moving through cities structured by choices and failures made over a century ago. Behavioral adaptation remains central. Habit, caution, and vigilance, once responses to immediate danger, became normalized and internalized. Cleanliness, organization, and careful observation became cultural expectations and markers of social competence. Children learned them from parents, schools reinforced them, and adults enacted them without conscious thought. The rhythms of life, subtly shaped by past exposure to filth, continue to influence urban behavior. Chapter 23. The Quiet Continuity of Urban Life. As we settle into the final pause in our exploration, it becomes clear that Victorian London's struggle with filth offers lessons far beyond 19th century streets. The story is not simply about dung, smoke, or overflowing sewers. It is about adaptation, memory, and the interaction between humans and their environment. Modern cities, while technologically advanced, inherit patterns and behaviors shaped by the past, and understanding those legacies can illuminate how urban life functions today. Infrastructure teaches silently. Water systems, sewers, and street planning are lessons encoded in brick and pipe. When they function, they are invisible. When they fail, their absence is immediately felt. The Victorians learned this painfully, and Londoners internalized vigilance as a result. Modern residents benefit from these same lessons, often without awareness, moving through cities structured by choices and failures made over a century ago. Behavioral adaptation remains central. Habit, caution, and vigilance, once responses to immediate danger, became normalized and internalized. Cleanliness, organization, and careful observation became cultural expectations and markers of social competence. Children learned them from parents, schools reinforced them, and adults enacted them without conscious thought. The rhythms of life, subtly shaped by past exposure to filth, continue to influence urban behavior. Chapter 23. The Quiet Continuity of Urban Life. As we settle into the final pause in our exploration, it becomes clear that Victorian London's struggle with filth offers lessons far beyond 19th century streets. The story is not simply about dung, smoke, or overflowing sewers. It is about adaptation, memory, and the interaction between humans and their environment. Modern cities, while technologically advanced, inherit patterns and behaviors shaped by the past, and understanding those legacies can illuminate how urban life functions today. Infrastructure teaches silently. Water systems, sewers, and street planning are lessons encoded